layers and layers and layers of information are coming out, not just because objects are being examined in detail, but also because new technologies can be applied to them.
Was the mask created for Tutankhamun or for someone else?
For over a century, one golden face has represented an entire civilization. It has been photographed more than almost any other object on Earth, printed on textbooks, coffee mugs, and museum banners, and held up as the single greatest surviving symbol of ancient Egyptian art. And yet, among the archaeologists, metallurgists, and Egyptologists who have spent their careers studying it closely, a quiet and increasingly public argument has been building for years. Not about whether the mask is real, not about whether it is beautiful, but about something far stranger, whether the face on it was ever meant to belong to the boy king at all. This is the story of that argument, how it started, why it refuses to die, and what the most advanced scientific tools available to archaeology have and have not been able to settle. It begins, as so much of this story does, in a narrow stone stairway in the Valley of the Kings, on a November evening in 1922. Howard Carter had spent years searching for an undisturbed royal tomb in a valley most experts believed had already given up its secrets. Funded by Lord Carnarvon, and running out of both money and time, Carter's team uncovered a step cut into the bedrock on November 4, 1922. Within days, they had exposed a sealed doorway. When Carter finally broke through into the antechamber and held a candle to the gap, what he saw stunned him into silence. A chamber-packed floor to ceiling with gilded couches, chariots, statues, boxes, and thrones, undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. It would take Carter's team nearly a decade to fully catalog and remove the contents of the tomb. But it was not until 1925, deep into the excavation, that they reached the innermost coffin and lifted away the linen wrappings to reveal the object that would come to define Tutankhamun in the popular imagination forever. A solid gold mask, weighing roughly 10 kilograms, inlaid with lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian, obsidian, and colored glass, its eyes seeming to track anyone who stood before it. To the ancient Egyptians, this was never simply a portrait. Gold was considered the flesh of the gods, incorruptible and eternal, and a funerary mask like this one served a specific religious function, to help the soul of the deceased recognize its own likeness in the afterlife, and to protect the head and face of the mummy on its journey through the underworld. Spells from the Book of the Dead are inscribed across its back and shoulders, invoking protection for the king as he passed into the realm of Osiris. 4 decades after its discovery, the mask was treated as an unambiguous, singular artifact, a masterwork commissioned for Tutankhamun and Tutankhamun alone. It was not until researchers began looking closely at the mask's construction, rather than simply admiring its surface, that questions started to surface. To understand why scholars started asking uncomfortable questions, it helps to understand just how unusual Tutankhamun's burial actually was. Compared to the tombs of other New Kingdom pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, his is small, cramped, even by royal standards. Many Egyptologists believe it was originally cut for someone of lower rank, possibly a noble or an official, and repurposed in a hurry after Tutankhamun's unexpected death around 1323 BCE, when he was roughly 18 or 19 years old. The physical evidence supports the idea of a rushed burial. Sections of the tomb's wall paintings appear unfinished. Splashes of paint on the walls suggest they may still have been wet when the tomb was sealed. The stone sarcophagus shows chips at its corners, as though it had to be forced into a space too small for it. And critically, a striking number of objects placed in the tomb, statues, shrines, coffins, and jewelry, bear evidence of having originally been made for, or inscribed with the names of, other members of the royal family, later altered to reference Tutankhamun instead. This kind of object reuse and rapid improvisation was not unheard of in ancient Egyptian royal burials, but the scale of it in Tutankhamun's tomb has long stood out to specialists in the period. Against that backdrop, the golden mask, the single most iconic object from the tomb, began to attract closer scrutiny. And the detail that scholars kept returning to, again and again, across nearly a century, was remarkably small. 2 small holes, one in each ear. In New Kingdom Egyptian royal art, pierced ears on a funerary mask were unusual for an adult male pharaoh. The convention overwhelmingly associated visible ear piercings with children, princesses, and queens, a feature tied to youth and, in many depictions, femininity. Adult kings were traditionally shown without them, even if, as some Egyptologists point out, royal mummies themselves, including Tutankhamun's, do show evidence of pierced ears from childhood, since earrings were commonly worn earlier in life and simply not depicted later on official images of grown kings. Carter himself noted the pierced ears in his original excavation records, though he did not pursue the implications at length. For decades the detail sat quietly in the archive, occasionally mentioned but rarely treated as significant. That began to change as later scholars started connecting it to other oddities: a facial structure on the mask that some researchers described as unusually delicate or feminine for typical royal portraiture of a young adult king, and a burial context already saturated with recycled objects originally intended for someone else. The obvious candidate at the center of the speculation was Tutankhamun's stepmother, one of the most famous and most mysterious women in ancient history. Nefertiti is, by most measures, one of the best-known faces of the ancient world, thanks to the painted limestone bust discovered at Amarna in 1912 and now housed in Berlin. She was the great royal wife of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who appended traditional Egyptian religion by elevating the sun disk Aten above the old pantheon and relocating the capital to a newly built city, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna. After roughly the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the historical record in her familiar role, and a mysterious co-regent or successor named Ankheperur Neferneferutin appears in inscriptions, a figure many Egyptologists believe was Nefertiti herself, ruling with pharaonic titles either alongside her husband or after his death. What happened to her after that point, where she was buried, and whether her mummy has ever actually been found remain genuinely unresolved questions in Egyptology. No tomb confirmed as hers has ever been located. That unresolved status is exactly what has made her such a persistent presence in theories about Tutankhamun's burial. If Neferneferutin died before a permanent tomb and full set of funerary equipment could be completed for her, and if Tutankhamun then died suddenly and unexpectedly less than a decade later, the possibility that his burial team repurposed objects, quite possibly including a partially finished royal mask, originally intended for her is not an outlandish leap. It fits a documented pattern of reuse already visible throughout the tomb. But a theory fitting a pattern is not the same as it being proven. And proving it required getting past the one thing that had protected the mask from generations of speculation. Nobody could look inside it without risking damage to an irreplaceable object. That changed, unexpectedly, in 2014. In August 2014, during routine handling at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the mask's long braided ceremonial beard, a separate gold element attached to the chin, symbolizing the pharaoh's connection to the god Osiris, became detached. Accounts from museum staff at the time differed on exactly how it happened, with some describing accidental impact during cleaning and others suggesting the beard had already been loose from age. What happened next became a genuine scandal. Rather than notifying international conservation experts, museum staff reattached the beard themselves using epoxy resin, an industrial adhesive never intended for use on ancient gold artifacts. The repair was rushed and visibly botched. Residue was left smeared across the mask's chin, and subsequent attempts to scrape away the excess glue with metal tools left faint scratches on the gold surface. When photographs of the visible glue line circulated publicly in early 2015, the reaction was immediate and international. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities faced sharp criticism, and 8 museum and ministry employees, including the museum's former director, were eventually referred to trial over the mishandling. To repair the damage properly, Egypt brought in a German-Egyptian conservation team led by Christian Ekman, a metal conservation specialist with extensive experience restoring ancient gold artifacts. Over several months starting in late 2015, Ekman's team carefully removed the epoxy by hand, without chemicals, using wooden tools and controlled heating, and reattached the beard using beeswax, closer to the adhesive techniques ancient Egyptian craftsmen themselves would likely have used. Because the mask was, for the first time in decades, off display and accessible to close physical examination, Ekman's team also carried out a full technical study of its construction, including X-ray fluorescence analysis capable of identifying the composition of the gold in different sections of the mask. This was, in effect, the first serious opportunity to test the Nefertiti theory scientifically. And a year earlier, that theory had already been pushed into the international spotlight by another researcher entirely. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published an analysis proposing that Tutankhamun's tomb had originally been designed for Nefertiti, not just the mask, but the burial chamber itself, which he argued showed evidence of blocked, plastered-over doorways consistent with a hidden extension. Reeves pointed to the pierced ears as one line of evidence that the mask's headdress, collar, and ears had originally been produced for a female ruler, arguing further that a slightly different gold alloy composition detectable in the face compared to the rest of the mask suggested the face itself had been added as a separate, later element, replacing whatever face had been there originally. He also argued that close inspection of the cartouches, the oval hieroglyphic name rings on the mask, showed subtle signs of having been reworked from Nefertiti's name to Tutankhamun's. Reeves's proposal made global headlines and briefly reshaped public understanding of the tomb. It also triggered a wave of remote sensing scans of the tomb walls searching for the hidden chamber he predicted. Those scans, carried out over the following years by independent research teams including radar specialists brought in by National Geographic and the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, ultimately did not find convincing evidence of a hidden doorway or chamber behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. That part of Reeves's theory is now widely regarded by most Egyptologists as unsupported. The question of the mask itself, however, turned out to be more complicated to settle, and this is where Ekman's direct physical examination becomes central to the story. Ekman's team had a rare opportunity most researchers before them never had: unmediated, hands-on access to the mask, including its interior, during the restoration process. Their conclusion, published in the years following the repair, directly challenged the core of Reeves's argument. Ekman reported finding no evidence that the face was composed of a different gold alloy than the rest of the mask, and no evidence that the cartouches bearing Tutankhamun's name had been carved over an earlier, erased name. He did confirm that the mask was constructed from separate pieces of gold joined together, the face as one element, the headdress and other components as others, but argued this was standard Egyptian metalworking practice for objects of this size and complexity, not evidence of later tampering or reuse. This is an important point often lost in more sensational retellings. Multi-part construction, on its own, is not proof of anything unusual. Ancient Egyptian goldsmiths regularly built large ceremonial objects from multiple cast and hammered sections joined by rivets, solder, or mechanical fittings, simply because casting or hammering a single object of this size and detail from one continuous piece of gold was impractical. The real question was never whether the mask has seams. It does. But whether those seams show evidence that one section was made for, and originally depicted, someone other than Tutankhamun. On that specific question, Ekman's team and Reeves reached opposite conclusions using different methods and, in some cases, working from different data. Reeves's alloy composition argument drew on published gold content figures. Ekman's team, working directly with the object, disputed the significance and interpretation of those figures. This is not an unusual situation in archaeological science. Two credentialed specialists examining overlapping but not identical evidence and drawing different conclusions from it. It is also precisely the kind of disagreement that tends to get flattened into more dramatic, simplified narratives once it reaches a wider audience. For several years after 2015, the debate largely settled into this standoff. Then, in late 2024, it reignited. In November 2024, Egyptologist Joan Fletcher, of the University of York, brought renewed public attention to the pierced ear question, building on both Reeves's earlier work and a fresh review of excavation-era documentation, including Carter's own notes. Fletcher's argument, presented publicly including in a history hit documentary, revived the claim that the mask's face was constructed from gold of a noticeably different composition than the rest of the mask, describing what she characterized as visible evidence of soldering consistent with a later face having been fitted onto an earlier, separately made mask, a mask, she argued, most plausibly originally made for a female ruler, quite possibly Nefertiti herself. The renewed attention drew sharp pushback from other prominent voices in Egyptology, including Zahi Hawass, the former head of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, who has long argued that pierced ears on funerary imagery were far more common among 18th dynasty royalty generally, male and female alike, than the female or child-only framing suggests, and that the feature alone cannot support conclusions about who a mask was originally made for. Other Egyptologists, including researchers writing in response through outlets like The Conversation, pointed back to Ekman's direct physical examination of the mask's interior as the strongest available counter-evidence, noting that his access to the object itself gives his metallurgical findings particular weight against arguments built primarily from historical photographs, published data, and comparative reasoning. As of now, this disagreement remains unresolved. No party in this debate has claimed a definitive, universally accepted final answer, and that is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier story. Reeves and Fletcher argue the physical and stylistic evidence points toward the mask having origins connected to a female predecessor, most likely Nefertiti or Nefertiti. Ekman and others who examined the mask directly during its 2015 restoration maintain that the available metallurgical evidence does not support that conclusion. Both sides are working from real data. They simply weigh and interpret it differently. It's worth stepping back and asking why this particular argument has resurfaced repeatedly for a decade, rather than being settled once and for all. Part of the answer is practical. The mask is one of the most heavily protected and rarely handled objects in the world, and every new round of access, like the brief window created by the 2014 Beard accident, produces new data that different specialists interpret through the lens of their existing positions. Part of the answer is also about the limits of the available techniques. X-ray fluorescence can tell you a great deal about surface composition and general alloy makeup, but it has real limitations when it comes to detecting extremely fine, expertly executed ancient joins, especially ones that may have been finished and polished to hide evidence of alteration, exactly as skilled goldsmiths 3,000 years ago would have known how to do. And part of the answer is simply that Tutankhamun's tomb, more than almost any other archaeological find in history, occupies a